Hi, welcome to Free Thinking Through the Fourth Turning. My name is Sasha Stone. They love bombed us with Kamala. If you know, you know. America is being love bombed by the Kamala Harris campaign. It's been confusing and disorienting. But so many are going along with it because how can they not? Being love bombed is hard to resist.
What is love bombing? Love bombing is somebody meeting you, putting you on a pedestal, and giving you everything you have ever looked for. All the attention, the love, the kind words, making you feel like you are their soulmate. And in a grand way, with grand gestures or any way that you truly need it to get you hooked and get you to commit to a relationship as quickly as possible. Every abusive relationship has some sort of love bombing stage. This is how they keep you around and keep you from walking away.
Yes, love bombed. That's what all of this looks like. And as any dime store trauma therapist will tell you, those who are the most insecure are the ones who must love bomb to erase any doubt or critical thinking. They know Kamala Harris is one bad interview away from losing this election. They know she's still the same Kamala that turned off so much of the American public. They know that sooner or later she will get triggered, and that temper will come out. They know that they have nothing else but this big lie they're all going along with. None of the past 4 years will mean anything, not amid a storm of love bombing. Harris can say anything, be anything, pretend anything, and she will get nothing but eyes in the shape of hearts looking back at her. Yes, so much of it is mass formation psychosis, coined by Matthias Desmet, as we slouch toward a technocratic totalitarian state.
Oh yes, I can. Mass formation refers to a phenomenon that has been studied by scholars throughout the last 2 centuries, I think. The first one who became really famous with a study on this phenomenon. They didn't always use the term mass formation. It was sometimes referred to as crowd formation. Different terms were used, but they all referred to the same phenomenon. They all referred to the emergence of a very specific kind of group formation in society, which has a very specific effect at the level of individual psychological functioning. And more specific, this mass formation makes individuals completely incapable of taking a critical distance of what the group believes in. That means that if the group believes in a narrative that is utterly absurd in many respects, it seems as if the people who are in the grip of the mass formation can't take a critical distance anymore, even when it concerns extremely intelligent people. That's so strange about mass formation. Intelligence doesn't protect you against it. It is even the case that how higher the level of education, the more vulnerable you become for mass formation. So, that's the first characteristic, the first strange effect mass formation has at the level of individual mental functioning. And then the second one is that people who are in the grip of mass formation, in a strange way, become willing to radically self-sacrifice. It is as if they are not aware anymore of all the individual of all the things that were important to them before the mass formation. They want to sacrifice everything, their wealth, their health, the future of their children, even their own lives. And then the third major effect of mass formation at the level of individual mental functioning is, and that's extremely important, that's maybe the most important one, is that it makes people radically intolerant for dissonant voices. So everyone who doesn't go along with the narrative, who doesn't buy into the narrative where the masses believe in, is considered an enemy and is considered someone who should be stigmatized, who should be discriminated, and who should be, in the end, eliminated. And this can take really absurd proportions, like in the major mass formations of recent history, or at least in the major mass formations of the 19th century, it turned out time and time again that children report their parents to the state if they do not follow the narrative, the mainstream narrative, and the other way around, that parents report their children to the state, even when it means that they will die.
During 2020, while we were all on lockdown, those who were online became part of a mass formation. Once they came together as one group that would go along with no masks, then mostly peaceful protests, then systemic racism, then vaccines, then lockdowns, then cancel culture, and finally a weaponized DOJ against Trump, they were both terrorized and compliant by the end of it. They had a volunteer army of fanatics who would punish them publicly if they said the wrong thing or stepped out of line. That kind of fear does strange things to a community, and it hasn't gone away. The formation is so united and so full of hatred and rage that our government could erect concentration camps or gulags and start throwing Trump and MAGA away, and all of them would celebrate. Bette Midler, Barbara Streisand, Rob Reiner, and Stephen King would cheer. Throughout the last 5 years, I kept waiting for more people to pull away from the herd and say, "What's going on here?" While some did, nowhere near enough to move the needle, certainly not among the dominant group in this country. And so it went on, and so it got worse. Even Trump surviving an assassin's bullet could not pull them out of it. As we saw during the entire DNC, they had only two things to offer us: a woketopia, if you can keep it, and Trump remains a clear and present threat. Here is a video by Tucker Carlson.
Consider what he intends to do if we give him power again. Consider his explicit intent to set free violent extremists who assaulted those law enforcement officers at the Capitol. His explicit intent to jail journalists, political opponents, and anyone he sees as the enemy.
Can I just interject here for a second? This woman's really scary. She could easily get elected president. She's much more skillful than I have ever seen. She's a liar on the deepest level. The things she is saying right now are not just untrue, they're the opposite of the truth, which is the hallmark of evil. She's an extremist. She'll say anything. She's much more like Gavin Newsom than I ever realized. I could go through a whole litany of why what she's saying is not true. It wasn't an armed mob. There's not one person inside the Capitol with a firearm, period. The only person who was shot in the Capitol was an unarmed woman shot by one of Nancy Pelosi's bodyguards. So again and again, she's telling us that she fought the cartels to secure the border. She's the border czar, and the border is controlled by the cartels.
She argued that Donald Trump, quote, tried to throw away your votes. Didn't the Democrat Party just throw away all the votes and install her?
Well, exactly. She's saying that Donald Trump will free from prison violent extremists, meaning like 75-year-old lower middle class women with diabetes, when she endorsed defunding the police and opening the prisons to allow actual criminals out, which is why the crime rate has spiked, to allow the population of Venezuela's prisons, Caracas's prisons, are now living in the United States because of her. I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, and I don't want to sound like I'm whining or fact-checking, which I hate, but what she's saying is the mirror image of the truth. She doesn't care. She's got no reference points in the truth, and she's an extremist. And she's a former prosecutor, and no former prosecutor should hold power, period. I've covered them my whole life. I've intensely disliked every single one of them for good reason. I think they're scary, they're liars, and they're megalomaniacal. And they put people in prison for political reasons. I've seen it again and again and again, and she's one of them.
The problem is that the love bombing will wear off. The Democrats are hoping to pull a fast one on the American public and bank the ballots ahead of the inevitable. But no one ever walks away from being love bombed feeling good. I'm going to build you an A-frame. I was once love bombed. It was a hot Tennessee Williams summer night in New Orleans. My sisters and I had driven across the country for a night on the town in the French Quarter. We were wearing vintage dresses, our lips smeared with bright red lipstick, our 80s perms, crimped and piled on top of our heads. "I'm going to build you an A-frame," the young man said to me as we danced in front of some kind of voodoo shop. "Yeah, an A-frame. You would like that, wouldn't you? You could move here, raise a family, have a nice life. I am just that much in love with you," he said. I wasn't yet 25. He was too drunk to even finish a sentence, and I was getting there. But so what? It was one of those nights where you don't know what's happening because everything is spinning in the heat and the music. It was a whirlwind of promises and tender mercies. The love bombing did convince me, even if just for an hour or two, that he meant it. And maybe we'd get married at a drive-through church and make it work somehow. Why not, I thought. Maybe it was true and there was such a thing as love at first sight. But not soon after his long list of promises and daydreams, off he went, moving in circles as someone who could barely stand. That A-frame found its way into my mind's eye and implanted itself where I could never forget it, decades later. I always thought, why would he make those promises anyway? That's what it felt like to endure those 4 agonizing days of the DNC. I didn't even watch them, but I could feel it pulsating across the internet. It was everywhere. It didn't matter how many times I unfollowed friends who posted tearful tributes, or how many ways I tried to change the algorithms. There it always was. All of that blue, all of that cheering, all of those pretty, pretty lies. They were trying to do what the Grinch did in the Dr. Seuss story. Take everything from MAGA and claim it as their own. American flags, freedom, tough on crime, patriotism. The media happily parroting their transformation. They look like Republicans now, they said. And then they tried to pretend that they were defined by joy, when really what bled through those 4 days was hate. The Democrats have destroyed themselves, betrayed every principle they once held, nearly destroyed trust in our democracy and our institutions, a 9-year odyssey to stop Americans from voting for Donald Trump. They have used their lawyers to throw Cornel West and RFK Jr. off of ballots in competitive states, just as they tried to do with Trump. They do not believe in democracy anymore. They can't afford it, not with candidates who aren't capable of even a softball interview with friendly press. We were love-bombed by so many of the same faces, hip, cool, rich, staring outward, telling us that if we don't vote for the woman of color over the white man, we will be dragging America backwards. We won't go back, they say. They've already shown us what they do to people who refuse to go along. You're called a racist and become toxic, and no one will hire you. For podcast listeners, a tweet from Walter Kern, quote, Dem leaders at the DNC declared they will never go back, yet declined to describe their plans for going forward. The Dems have truly become the party of faith. After RFK Jr. endorsed Trump, all of the elite ruling class crybabies took to Twitter to shame him publicly. Yes, even the long-forgotten actress Daryl Hannah, who once dated JFK Jr., was out there doing the good work of destroying someone she once called a friend. Podcast listeners, a tweet from Kerry Kennedy. I am sharing a personal statement that my family and I have made in response to my brother's announcement. And it reads, Statement on Robert F. Kennedy Jr.'s announcement today. We want an America filled with hope and bound together by a shared vision of a brighter future, a future defined by individual freedom, economic promise, and national pride. We believe in Harris and Walls. Our brother Bobby's decision to endorse Trump today is a betrayal of those values that our father and our family hold most dear. It is a sad ending to a sad story. Kathleen Kennedy Townsend, Courtney Kennedy, Carrie Kennedy, Chris Kennedy, Rory Kennedy. The destruction machine is now in high gear as we're seeing stories bloom online about his college days, his affairs, that he's lost his mind. Podcast listeners, a headline, RFK Jr. sold me coke at Harvard, claims best-selling author. They tell themselves this is all necessary because they are facing a terrorist threat on par with 9/11, Pearl Harbor, the Civil War. They see themselves as the good guys beating back fascism in the Second Confederacy. Yet they don't seem to connect Trump to his millions of supporters who have every right to choose him as their representative. Propaganda rules. Once you have a mass formation of a dominant cultural group as we're living through now, how easy it is to sell them pure propaganda. How dare anyone question a tweet or a headline? They go along with it as long as they feel good. If they feel bad, they might start to splinter off. That's what happened to me in 2020, and it's what happened to this TikTok user who might as well be telling my story.
When I walked away from the Democratic Party in summer 2020, it was because I could no longer reconcile the response to COVID, especially compared to the response to the BLM riots. I could not stomach the blatant hypocrisy that was punching me in the gut. And for the first time in my life, genuinely the first time, I realized that the government and that the party of tolerance and compassion actually didn't care about me at all. And worse yet, I knew that I wasn't the only one who was suffering due to the response to COVID. I knew that, in fact, millions of Americans, including obviously Black Americans, were going to survive COVID no problem, but were being actively and assuredly destroyed by the response to COVID. You know, I was already struggling before COVID, like millions of Americans, and then the response to COVID made that struggle worse. But they didn't care. They refused to acknowledge that I might have an honest reason for disagreeing with them. And instead, the story that they decided to tell themselves and tell each other was that I had been racist my whole life and just hid it, or that I woke up one day and chose racism because obviously somehow this was all about racism, as opposed to actually just listening to my story, which is true and also incidentally far more believable. And that's why I relate to Donald Trump, who I started liking in 2020 after years of hating him, because at the time, and a lot of people forget this, at the time he was the only one speaking up about opening the country again. And of course, now in retrospect, I know he wasn't the only one, but you have to understand that when you are someone who knows nothing about politics the way I was, the way most Americans are, you don't know who all these different senators and governors are, especially when they're not your own. You don't know anything. You just know the president. I knew I hated him, but then I also suddenly knew that he was someone who was at least remotely pushing back against this narrative. And it truly was a situation of the enemy of my enemy became my friend. And I came to the only logical conclusion that a person can come to once they look into it for themselves, and that is that if this man were even remotely as bad as they say he is, they wouldn't have to lie. They could just tell me the truth. And I know what it's like to be lied about. I know what it's like to be willfully and maliciously misinterpreted. I know what it's like to be portrayed in the least charitable light possible. I know what it's like to fight for good and just causes and to be called evil and racist and misogynistic because of it. I know what it's like to have them come for you, for your beliefs, to have them come for your income, for your job, for your ability not only to thrive, but also just to survive. I know what that's like, and that's why I feel it so much when he says they're after me, he's just standing in the way. Because it's true. The left is vicious, they're hateful, they're un-American. They will stop at nothing.
But had I not passed through the feeling bad part, I might never have gotten to the critical thinking part and the escaping the cult part. The summer of 2020 wasn't just a bummer summer of COVID. It was the birth of newfound fanaticism, a central purpose for the already united Democrats who found religion when they heard Obama speak for the first time. I was among them. I sometimes wonder what it must feel like to be Barack Obama, to have that much power over so many people who love and revere you. His influence is felt throughout all cultural and institutional life in this country. We are forever changed as a result of his presidency. Yet that's also why he can't let go, and especially to Donald Trump. The Obamas still feel personally insulted by Trump, going back to the birther scandal. That Trump beat Obama's chosen successor meant war. Not war for MAGA, but war for the ruling class against MAGA. Their collective joy would ultimately depend on the destruction of the bad people. This is the danger of totalitarianism, as Desmond explains.
We all have the capacity in ourselves to change the world through sincere speech. That's the most important thing. As soon as we realize that, we should realize that we have this enormous responsibility, each and every one of us, to try to live up to that first and foremost ethical duty of the human being, to articulate the words that seem sincere and honest. And if we do that, we will, no matter how few of us there are, but we will just prove more powerful than even the most sophisticated and the most, the largest propaganda machinery in history, in human history. The truth, in the end, will prove more powerful. But we shouldn't be naive when talking and thinking about the truth. We should never think that we are the only ones who possess the truth. We should never think that we possess the truth, because if you think that you possess the truth, you already lost it. Truth is something that is always outside of ourselves, with which we can sometimes resonate a little bit, feel it a little bit, and it is at that moment that we have to have the courage to articulate it. And that's what will make the difference.
The Obama coalition, Hillary Clinton, all of Hollywood, all of the corporate press and the billionaires that own it, simply refuse to allow their grip on power to be loosened. They have enlisted the help of the FBI, an army of lawyers, and a media that will perpetuate their propaganda and their lies. Podcast listeners, a tweet from Steve Cortez, "The power of propaganda," and it shows favorable, unfavorable, with Harris at the very last taking a sharp uptick to meet Trump. We are locked into a reverse power hierarchy that ranks people according to race and gender or victimhood or marginalized status. Those who are the religious symbols to be elevated at all costs. As long as the left believes itself to be on the side of good, they feel justified in everything they do to those they've targeted as bad. Harris doesn't have to do interviews or name her policy. She fits their desire to be represented by a symbol, a woman of color, and that perpetuates the delusion. The problem remains that they have never confronted the reason Trump won in the first place, just as they've never confronted the populist uprising that began in 2008 after the Wall Street bailout, the crisis that sparked the fourth turning. They swapped out what Vivek Ramaswamy calls woke capitalism, rather than confront the problems of the working class.
But then something else happened right around the same time, which was the birth of a new strand of the left. With the election of Barack Obama as the first black president of the United States in 2008, there was the birth of a new strand of the left around that same time that had a slightly different theory of the case. And what they said was, well, hold on a second, Occupy Wall Street, okay? It's not just economic injustice. It's not just poverty that we care about. We have some new concerns on the left, like racism and misogyny and bigotry and, of course, climate change. You know what? This turned out to be the opportunity of a lifetime for big business in this country. Because if you're big business, if you're Wall Street, Occupy Wall Street is a pretty tough pill to swallow. But the new woke stuff was actually pretty easy. You applaud diversity and inclusion. You put some token minorities on your boards. You muse about the racially disparate impact of climate change after you fly in a private jet to Davos. It's pretty good work if you can get it. But they did not do it for free. They expected that new left to look the other way when it came to leaving their corporate power intact, and it worked masterfully like a charm for both sides. That is the story of how a bunch of big banks got in bed with a bunch of woke millennials who themselves are hungry for a cause. Together they birthed woke capitalism, and they used that to put Occupy Wall Street, the old left, up for adoption. And it worked so well on Wall Street that Silicon Valley then said, okay, we're going to get in on that. Because, you know what, if you're Silicon Valley back in 2010, 2009, threat to your power used to come from the left. Break up big tech was not a right-wing slogan back then. It was a left-wing slogan back then. They were skeptical of the monopoly power of the rise of concentrated behemoths in Silicon Valley. So you know what Silicon Valley said? They said, okay, we can make that same deal with you. We will censor hate speech and misinformation as you define it. We will use our power to advance your substantive ends, but again, we will not do it for free. We effectively expect the new left to look the other way when it comes to leaving our monopoly power intact. And again, that trade worked masterfully for both sides. That is the story of this unholy alliance, this arranged marriage. It was not a marriage of love. It was an act of mutual prostitution, and the net result of that act was the birth of a new Leviathan, far more powerful than what Thomas Hobbes envisioned 400 years ago, far more powerful than what our founding fathers envisioned 250 years ago, this new woke industrial, ESG industrial complex that's a hybrid of government power and corporate power that together could accomplish what neither could on its own. And then that's how you get the litany of what you saw follow in the years thereafter. The rest of corporate America gets in on the act. Coca-Cola making statements about a new voting law in Georgia that make it sound more like a super PAC than a soft drink manufacturer, teaching its employees how to be less white. Their words, not mine. While they do nothing about, by the way, their own impact on a nationwide epidemic of diabetes and obesity in the black community that they profess to care so much about, or Nike that decries slavery 250 years ago in the United States without saying a peep about using slave labor in places like China today to get $250 sneakers that they sell to black kids in the inner city who can't afford to buy books for school. This is the whole litany. Okay, it just keeps going on and on.
Meanwhile, we see Julia Louis-Dreyfus, Ben Stiller, and J.J. Abrams wandering around the DNC and all of those at the top of the food chain, still in desperate need of absolution for their sins of wealth and privilege. Trump still stands because he's not going to abandon the half of the country in desperate need of change. He doesn't stand alone now, not with powerful allies like RFK Jr. and Elon Musk standing with him. We're not just defeating a political party. We're attempting to dismantle creeping totalitarianism that will only get worse if they do manage to drag Harris over the finish line. But to defeat them will require matching and besting their ground game. Those mail-in ballots, ballot harvesting, $1 billion in campaign funds, they barely even need a candidate at all. And that is what Harris really is, not a candidate at all. Thank you for listening to my podcast, sashastone.substack.com. I will be traveling to Telluride, Colorado for the film festival all next week. I hope to be able to still post, but I'm not sure I'll have time to record podcasts, but check out sashastone.substack.com to see if I will be dropping any updates there. Otherwise, I'll be back in a week. And remember, to thine own self, be true.
I put a spell on you because you're mine. You better stop the things you do. I tell you, I ain't lying. You know I can't stand it. You're running around. You know better, Daddy. I can't stand it 'cause you put me down.